Okay, hello and welcome. Are you digging the Noah's Ark artwork in the background? I don't know, maybe I'll have to move the computer so we can look at something else. As much craziness as my life has gone through recently with the move back to America and, all that I'm trying to get now restarted here, things have been happening in the world. Part of the reason that I started this channel is to just talk about random things that are of interest to me and hopefully of interest to you because you're watching this video. And so two major icons of my youth passed away recently or somewhat recently. I'm sure by now you've read the title, so you know who I'm going to talk about. So let's see, I was born in 1969. I'm now 40 years old. I turned 40 about a month ago. So I was a teenager in the 1980s. I turned, 11 in 1980, in the middle of 1980. So the 80s were really, my adolescence, from 11 to, the late 80s. I turned 20 in 1989. So Michael Jackson and John Hughes, two very different individuals, were a huge part of my growing up and my teenage years. And I just thought I should comment a little bit about them. There's not much that I can add to everything that's already been said about these two guys from people probably much wittier and more interesting than myself. But I very much remember, 1982, 1983, when Michael Jackson's Thriller album came out. My personal story with that is we got our first VCR in 1983. I think we got it for Christmas. And there used to be a show. We didn't have cable. My parents wouldn't get cable. We were living in Dallas, and there was a show, and it was on, I think it was on all across America. It was called Friday Night Videos, and it was on late. It was on from I want to say 11:30 to 1 a.m. And they would let me stay up even though I was probably, 12 or 13. So I was probably a junior high student. But because, there was no school the next day unless I had a soccer game or something on Saturday early, they would let me stay up, and I would watch all these videos because, this was the peak of music videos, ZZ Top and Duran Duran and of course Michael Jackson. And the very first thing I taped on the VCR with my very first blank tape was the world premiere on regular television of Thriller, the huge, 13-minute version or whatever. And I used to play that tape over and over and watch that video all the time. And honestly, as I've grown older, I'm still a Michael Jackson fan, but the album for me that really I put in my CD player all the time in my car in Japan when I was driving around was Off the Wall. If you don't have Off the Wall, get it. It's an amazing album. And it really is the blueprint for the whole career of certain modern singers like Justin Timberlake and Usher. I think they listened to Off the Wall and boom, that's their style now. It's a great album. Thriller's great, but it's almost overplayed, at least for me. So definitely get Off the Wall. Rock with me, rock with you. Don't Stop Till You Get Enough. She's Out of My Life, the one that Eddie Murphy makes fun of him for crying. And Michael Jackson's going to be one of those interesting figures in history as time goes on. Is he going to be remembered for everything amazing that he did as an entertainer? I mean, the Jackson 5 and the moonwalk on the Motown show, which I was watching when it was on TV. I remember that night too. Or, are the bad parts of his life, the child molestation charges and, the weirdness of his life going to take over as the years go on. He's going to be one of those conflicted people in people's minds, I think, for a long time to come. But I remain a fan. I thought he was brilliant when he, back in the day. And, it's sad to see him go. I think these new concerts would have been really interesting in London. The other person is John Hughes. And I do a series on this page where I talk about movies, and I kept putting off talking about John Hughes because I had a box set of his movies on DVD that I wanted to talk about in the binder that I was kind of going through. And in that box set are the three seminal movies: Breakfast Club, 16 Candles, and Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And you know, if he had never done anything other than those three movies, I would still be talking about him now. But when you add in the fact that he wrote Mr. Mom, the Vacation movies, which are really, really funny, and, you know, other movies like Pretty in Pink, Some Kind of Wonderful, of course Home Alone, which I'm not a big fan of, but, you know, I understand its appeal. But you just, I guess you had to be a teenager, and maybe that's why people around my age, you know, when we talk about John Hughes, maybe some of you that are a little bit younger don't quite get it, but you had to be a teenager in the early 80s, you know, when those movies were coming out, to really get, like, how amazingly funny and fresh and interesting, you know, 16 Candles and The Breakfast Club. You know, The Breakfast Club, you look at it on paper and it looks like, you know, it's going to be just all kinds of cliche and you know, just boring, and it's such a good movie and it holds up. And I think those movies really do, although there's a lot of 80s stuff in them, and part of them, you know, do obviously feel very dated. They really do hold up well, and I've watched them with my niece, for instance, in the past, say, you know, 5 or 10 years, and they're still as good as I think they were 20 years ago. And Ferris Bueller is one of my top 10 all-time favorite movies, you know, ever. And so, you know, and even something like Uncle Buck, which was my former girlfriend's like favorite John Hughes movie, and we used to watch that all the time. There's tiny little bits and pieces in his movies that are so funny. And then he did, you know, really good adult comedy too, like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, which is, if you haven't seen it, is, you know, it's like a holiday classic now. Steve Martin and John Candy. And so you just look, you go to like to the imdb.com and you look at, you know, his whole list, and he obviously stopped making movies in the early 90s. Okay, see ya. And that was my dad and our dog. Okay, a little bit of reality there. So anyway, you know, rent a John Hughes movie in the next month and watch it. If you've never seen the really classic, you know, early, you know, Brat Pack movies, definitely try them. 16 Candles, you know, and Breakfast Club and Ferris Bueller. I can't even explain to you how much my friends and I used to quote those movies, and how much we wore out those early like beta copies. Yes, my friend Jack had a beta player. And then, of course, VHS copies of those movies, and just how much affection I have in my heart for those films. And they were such a part of my childhood that it is sad that he's gone. But, of course, like Michael Jackson, you know, the last thing he did of any relevance was many, many years ago. But that doesn't dim my appreciation for what he did achieve when he was, you know, in that kind of 10-year span, when he was highly productive. And yeah, it's sad to see him go. You always hope that he'd make one more great movie, or Michael Jackson would make one more great album. And who knows, they might have. But both died, you know, too young, and so they will be missed. Okay, thanks for watching as always, and hopefully I'll film another one of these soon. Peace.